in preaching circles, among theoreticians about preaching, one of the common sins of preachers is to use a text in the Bible as a pretext. You grab something because the words work, and you grab it and you run off somewhere that really has nothing to do with the text itself, but the text gave you the excuse to go do this thing. And I actually am doing that today, but not with the Bible. I'm doing that today with the book that I referenced. I'm really glad that a couple of friends annoyed me until I read it. I enjoyed reading it. It's a book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul by John Philip Newel. And the book is a survey of several theologians, starting, well, actually before Pelagius, I think, with Irenaeus, and then, marching through Christian history and finding a number of theologians that Newell sees as, ideological partners, or ideological, they're in the same tribe ideologically or thinking wise. And so I enjoyed the book, and it was helpful. But really, well, to start with, and Gerald and you and I were talking about this yesterday, the book is a survey of historical figures. It's been a long time since I was engaged with the study of historical theology, and I am absolutely incompetent to assess this author's, accuracy and fairness and all, as a historian. I don't know that material that well. And then my first encounter with the book, I listened to it and found it engaging, and I appreciated it. And then I thought, for this class, I really should get it and put my eyeballs on the text. And when I put my eyeballs on the text, I was going, my impression had been when I was listening that I was hearing a whole lot of John Philip Newel, and maybe not quite as much of the voice of the people he was, surveying. And then when I read the book, that really came through much, much more. So the book is a pretext. Go read it if you like. But I'm not going to try to stay with the book. I'm going to use that as an excuse to launch into my own presentation. Growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, in my elementary school years, the word creation was a wonderful word because it evoked Overton Park and Shelby Forest State Park. It evoked the parks that we took our Sabbath afternoon hikes in. And creation was the Boundary Waters canoe area, which featured in the stories of Sam Campbell that many of you will know. A little bit older, creation meant biology, and that was bird watching and identifying trees and flowers, and that's what creation meant. Then as I moved into my teen years, I became aware that within the Adventist context, creation was the name of our campaign against godless scientists who questioned 6,000 years and Noah's flood. Over the next number of decades, I followed that debate within the church fairly closely, even participated a tiny bit in it. But in recent years, I have moved completely away from that. In a sense, I've returned to creation, or creationism even, in the way that I first encountered it as an elementary school kid. It's the name of nature. And I have been engaged in a fairly significant, intense engagement with nature at the level of poetry and aesthetic engagement. I'm not a scientist. I like science, and I even like a few scientists. But I'm not a scientist. I'm a poet. I used to be a preacher. I'm not even a preacher anymore. I'm a poet and a contemplative. Oh, and Gerald, something you mentioned yesterday, you and I share, and I'm a runner. I am more consistently a contemplative than I am a runner, but I did my 4 miles last night in the backyard, by the way, because I no longer can run on roads. I've got some challenges, so I have to stay on soft surfaces. So I ran 4 miles in the back pasture. And
good for you.
So, I keep wanting to jump in and give you an example or cite an example of some of the negative stuff that I'm wanting to push against. And then I remind myself, no, I want to begin with what I am for. I want to begin with what I admire, because that is what has shaped my life for the last 15 or, well, coming up to 20 years. I spend about an hour every day, and every day, 80% of the days. I spend about an hour every day before dawn, sitting in my back pasture, watching the sky. And I would love to say watching the stars, but here in Seattle, stars you get maybe 60% of the time. This time of year, maybe 30% of the time, but watching the sky and enjoying creation. I've got my cottonwood trees that I look at every morning, the Doug fir trees. Occasionally there's birds to keep me company, and the sky, the ever-changing sky. And I think that this hour of daily enjoyment has spilled over into the rest of my life, and perhaps it's enabled me to find even more enjoyment. As I was thinking about doing this presentation, I think it was, let's see, this is Wednesday night. Went in, sat in my back pasture. Usually it's morning, but Wednesday night I sat in the back pasture, and I wrote something. Something came to my mind, thinking about you guys, that I want to share with you. Oh, if I can find it. I thought I had it open here. Yes, here it is. 8 p.m. Wednesday night, the middle pasture at Berry Creek Farm. I'm sitting in my pasture looking at the stars and listening to the frogs. And the wonderful thing is, frogs have just started here. Last week, no frogs. Saturday night, I heard the first frog. And by Monday night, it was a cacophony, a glorious frog song. So I was listening to frogs and watching the stars. There is competition for my attention, highway noise, and light pollution. The neighbors on both sides of me have multiple bright yard lights. So I have to sit strategically where buildings or vehicles can block some of that light to enable me to more freely enjoy the sky. And the frog chorus is loud and wonderful, pulsing, throbbing, ebullient, enthusiastic. But there's road noise too. Without thinking, I see the ancient shapes over my head, starting with Canis Major to the south, and then Orion, Bootes, Pleiades, Auriga, Taurus, the big and little dippers over to the north. Eastward, Leo the lion is just raising his head and shoulders above the horizon. I know the shapes of these constellations from decades of staring at them, and having names for those shapes in the sky, even though I know there's no astronomical connection. Having names for those shapes in the sky adds, an affectionate familiarity when I look at them. They're my friends. The brighter stars, they have this penetrating brilliance. Sirius in the constellation of Canis Major, the brightest star. Capella in Auriga. It's directly overhead. I lean back in my chair and watch for a while. I wish I could bring all of you there. We're good, Adventist progressives, people with a background of Spectrum and Adventist Today. I've been hanging around us for a few decades now, and we are really good at debating. We've got lots of ideas, and of course, about half of yours are wrong. Mine are all correct.
No, Bubby. You got all sorts of help today.
Yeah. But before we get to the debate, I wish that we could have this experience. I wish we could all sit together in my back pasture, or even better, at a place about 45 minutes east of here where it would be quiet and there's no light pollution, and that we could spend a while listening to frog song and watching the sky and knowing the convivial presence of other watchers and listeners. Humans are naturally philosophers. And maybe in our crowd, we are even more natural than others in that respect. But we're also worshipers. We are lovers. And it seems to me that one way to think about worship is it is a communal experience of love, where we set aside some of our analytical angst and for just a little while give ourselves to adoration, admiration, and enjoyment. And that's what I would wish for us, that we could begin with that. We could begin in a place of joy. I laughed a bit ruefully, Lauren, after you put up the notice on Facebook. I noticed the first comment, and as I read it, and now I will name the negativity that I push against. So this person was writing back, and it was classic historic or Adventism. It's what I grew up with. So I'm not wanting to throw stones, and I'm not wanting to show disrespect, but it talked about sanctification, and it's not finished until we get to heaven. And clearly implied in this statement was that being, quote, fully sanctified is the only acceptable state of being. But of course, you're not ever acceptable in this life. And so then we fix that by, and I'm going to, but justification. That I'm going, wait a minute. So what you've got is you've got two theological concepts. You said, on one hand, I am unacceptable and I cannot be acceptable and I will never be acceptable. But I've got an excuse. It's an excused absence. Justification. It'll cover me until I can get to the place where I'm really supposed to be. And I hurt, because I'm guessing that the person who's writing this, if that person was my neighbor, I'd be watching over the fence at the way she takes care of her kids or feeds her dog or takes care of her neighbors. And I would be admiring the goodness that is resident in her. I was fortunate in my decades as a pastor. Most of the congregations I was part of, that they were healthy, functional places. And sure, they humans are an uneven stew, and there might be a stinker or two, but in general, they were communities of people who cared for each other and for those outside of it, their own circles. And I kept wondering, when I would watch some of these people eaten up with angst about the fact that they were not yet perfect, and I'm over here going, oh, folks, I actually think you are so good that probably you already died and went to heaven, and God kicked you out and said, no, go back down to earth. They need you down there, a reverse Enoch kind of thing. And yet still some of these dear people will be eaten with this angst that they're not acceptable. And it goes back to, some of the notions of original sin, Augustine's idea of, total depravity. And now I want to go to Scripture and do a bit of analysis there. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Come to the end. And God saw that everything he made, it was very good. But then, boy, things go off the track almost immediately. You have Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit, and then you have Cain killing Abel, and boy, it's into a mess. And so a lot of Christians, especially in the West, have taken this to say, yes, no, God made no mistakes. God made a beautiful thing, but humans screwed it up, and they screwed it up irrevocably and absolutely. And so that the perfection of creation is really an irrelevant memory. It has nothing to do with the world we live in. I disagree with that view strongly. But I don't think that I've mischaracterized it, that for many folks, the perfection of pre-fall Eden is irrelevant for our world. Our world, what's important in our world is death, sin, evil, mayhem. But then let's go to the creation story in the New Testament, the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things were made through him, nothing was made without him. And then where does it go? And we have seen his glory, full of grace and truth. And then John goes on into the story of the ministry of Jesus, the calling of the disciples. Creation, the beautiful creation of John 1:1 continues through the ministry of Jesus. And in John, Jesus tells his disciples, you're going to do even greater things than I have done. The glory and beauty of creation at the beginning of John's gospel continues through John's gospel, and is projected beyond John's gospel into the ordinary life of the followers of Jesus. And then I want to take us to the Gospel of Matthew. It's my go-to, someone, I don't preach much these days. So they say, preach. I go, okay, I'll preach. I'm going to preach out of the Gospel of Matthew, always. Let me get to my notes here. No, it's right there, the first thing. Right at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, you have this, the people sitting in darkness have seen a great light. So, and of course you have the genealogy of Matthew, which names a whole bunch of people who were scoundrels. So Matthew is realistic. He knows that we live in a world that, has pain, has suffering, has evil, cruelty, darkness. He says, but Jesus was the great light. On those sitting in darkness, a great light has shined. And then we go to the teachings of Jesus. And, growing up, it was always emphasized, that Jesus knew the Bible and that he quoted the Bible, which is true. But what we often neglect is that Jesus rooted a number of his most startling ethical exhortations and his most affirming affirmations, God's goodness. He rooted those statements not in the Old Testament, not in a text, but in nature. Jesus uses nature in a very positive way as a foundation for the wisdom that he brings. We can go with, I'll start with something that may not immediately strike you as being this use of nature, but we'll see. In the Sermon on the Mount, after we get through the Beatitudes, we start off in chapter 6. So chapter 5, I'll come back to it in a minute, but chapter 6 begins with, don't do your acts of charity to be seen by others. Why? Because your Father in heaven is watching and he will reward you. Don't pray as a spectacle. Instead, pray in private. Why? Because you can be confident your Father in heaven will hear and will respond. And you don't have to use a whole bunch of words because he already knows what you need and he will respond. And then you go, so where is this notion of Father? What is the mental context for Jesus of this word Father? When you go through the synoptic gospels, and I'll stick with the Gospel of Matthew because there I'm fairly confident I know what I'm talking about. If you go through the synoptic gospels, go through the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses the word Father repeatedly referring to God. When you study the context of those uses, it's very clear the picture that he has of Father. And it is not an authority figure. It is rather Father as provider and defender. This business here, you don't have to use a bunch of words because your father, your daddy knows what you need and will provide. And then, of course, you go on through chapter 6, don't worry about clothes, because look how your Father dresses up the flowers. You don't have to worry about food. Look how he feeds the birds who don't store things up. All the way through chapter 6, Jesus keeps exhorting people to live free of worry and fear because of their Father. And it is not a Father image drawn primarily from the Old Testament. It is a Father image drawn from his knowledge and he presumes that his hearers know what the word Father means. And this is highlighted in chapter 7 when he says, hey, which of you, if your kid asks for a loaf of bread, you'll give him a rock. If he asks for a fish, we'll give him a snake. No. If you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things? Jesus appeals to his hearers' own knowledge rooted in their life in the ordinary world. He says, you know some things because, and then you can use what you know. You know how a Father is. Okay, that's God. Now, a bunch of us might respond, yeah, but that word Father, that's a tricky word. I remember when I was in New York, I tell this story often, a gal had been coming to the church for, I don't know, some months. We ran into each other out on the street and we chit-chatted for a few minutes and she said, John, can you quit using the word Father in your sermons? Because every time you use that word, I'm gone for 5 or 10 minutes. And then, she shared some of her story, and it was, of course, a tale of horrific abuse. Father did not work for her. If God is Father, then Lord, I'm going somewhere else. So that is a reality. In my previous congregation in Green Lake, there were 2 women who, leading women. Some of you may know Holly Carpenter. She was a preacher. She's now teaching music, but a great preacher. And when Holly would talk about her mother, you could have only one of 2 reactions. The first one would be, I had a mother like that, with a big smile on your face. Or, I wish I had had a mother like that. Because when Holly would talk about her mother, my instinctive reaction is, wow, now that's what a mother should be. That's how God designed motherhood. There was another woman in the church, prominent woman in the church named Ruth Christensen. Some of you may know her. Again, when she would speak of her mother, mother for Ruth was this wonderful, magnificent word because it described a wonderful, magnificent person. And so I challenged both of them, especially Holly as a preacher. I said, Holly, I need you to preach a sermon about God as mother. I don't have the personal history that equips me to give that sermon, but it needs to be given. And you can give it because you've got the personal history that will empower, that kind of message. So Jesus, when he's telling us about God, his most fundamental reference point is not the text, but it is creation. It is what a good dad does. And what I would immediately speculate is that this tells us also a whole lot about Joseph. Because Jesus never develops this notion of God as Father in a theological sense. He simply grabs the word and runs with it. But the connotation, the aura that surrounds this word must be what was the native idea in Jesus' head. And I'm going, where did that come from? It came from his family of origin. So I'm presuming, and obviously there's no external evidence for this one way or the other. I'm assuming that that must have been the kind of person Joseph was, because consistently all through the synoptic gospels, Jesus uses this word Father over and over and over again, and it is consistently this picture of the daddy you would turn to when you needed to, and you would do it with confidence. I have a friend, Kevin, that I'm going, Joseph was a dad like my friend Kevin. My sense is that Kevin's entire world turns to him, his church world, his family world, his neighbors, I'm assuming. He's just that kind of guy. When you need help, call Kevin. On our Talking Rocks tours, I always want Kevin to come along, and people ask, so what does he do? I go, I have no idea what he does. I just know that when he's around, life is better. Life is good. And that's the picture Jesus paints of God the Father. When God's around, things are good because he's daddy. And then we go to the most stirring ethical challenge that Jesus gives us. You've heard it said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for them. Why? Because that's the way your daddy is. And he doesn't say, well, that's how your daddy is, and then quote some Old Testament passage. He says, look at what your daddy does with sunshine and rain. He goes straight to creation. And he says, you be like the Creator. Indiscriminately, profligately generous. It was a creation ordinance. So when I come back to creation and unabashedly revel in the beauty and glory of creation, I'm going, I've got some Bible warrant behind me. I don't have to contradict the Bible to affirm nature. And so I don't. Now, if I may, I'm going to go to a few celebrations of nature. I sometimes write poetry, sometimes it's just prose musings, but this is a prose piece from, let's see, January 12. Now here in Seattle, temperatures are pretty mild most of the time. We have rain, but that's about it. But we had a little cold snap. It got, for us, really cold. Gerald was laughing at me. John, you don't know what cold is. Come to Chicago. And yes, I realize that. We have relatives in Minnesota, and yeah, they laugh when I go, it's really cold here. It's 17 degrees. And they're going, oh, that's not cold. All right. The journal entry is 9 p.m. on January 12th. I don't remember what day of the week it was. Snow falling, temperatures dropping. The resident horse maven, Karen, that's this lady over here, she said that the horses needed blankets. I volunteered, noble soul that I am. The real reason I volunteered, it was the perfect excuse to be outside. I pulled on layers, insulated ski pants over my jeans and long underwear. So 3 layers on the bottom, 2 coats over my 2 sweatshirts, plus a hat and mittens, and I headed out into the night. The night worked its predictable magic. The snow was sparse, both on the ground and in the air, but sufficient to add charm and light to the dark. 2 of the dogs came along and raced off after invisible and perhaps imaginary rabbits. The horse blankets were hanging from rafters in the feed room. I pulled the first one down and checked the name written on it with a marker and laughed at the argument that the horse maven and I have had about horse blankets. She does not understand why I have to label the blankets. The turquoise one, she said, is Jericho's, and the green one is Bolero's. Now, for some of you, you're going, well, yeah. And a few of you are going, yeah, turquoise and green. How are you going to tell that apart? And then some of the rest of you might understand my dilemma. Even if I could tell turquoise and green apart, how would I remember from 1 month to the next, turquoise goes on which horse? But fortunately, I had taken a magic marker and I wrote their names on it. So there. All right, I grabbed the blankets and headed out with them. When I opened the gate into Jericho's paddock, the latch chain made its characteristic metallic clatter, and Jericho, as usual, left his hay long enough to stick his head around the corner to see what I was up to. He went back to eating while I tossed the blanket on his back and fastened it across his chest, under his belly, and around his hind legs. As I was reaching over and under and around his shaggy coat, I marveled at the intimacy granted me by this very large mammal. My only wariness around Jericho comes from our difference in size. A casual movement by him might have non-casual consequences for me. I don't take my ease around Jericho for granted, because we have another horse on the property who I am not easy around for good reason. At the time I wrote this, I was still recovering from an injury inflicted deliberately by that other horse. So being easy around Jericho is a great privilege that I take great pleasure in. After Jericho, I blanketed Samson, an amiable giant, also completely trustworthy. I reached over and under and around him with casual ease, again marveling at the permission granted by this massive mammal. How much does Samson weigh? 1,200 pounds, more than half a ton. And I don't weigh that much. Heading down the aisle from Samson's paddock to the last one, to Bolero's stall way down at the end of the alley, I was caught up in the magic of the night. The aisle is formed by railroad tie posts and 2x6 rails. Some of the ties, the posts need to be replaced. They were old when we bought this place 25 years ago. They're older now. Some of the rails I've replaced already, and in the dark I could see that there's still more that need to be replaced. Tonight, as is often the case, my awareness of needed repairs, though, was swamped by appreciation for the beauty of old wood. I relish the textures and colors and patterns in the wood of the fence and the beams and the siding of the barn. I think of the visions of green and tan lichen that decorate the fence in places, bits of loveliness that greet me when the sun shines. Walking the alley this evening, I recall the distinctive smell of the paddocks in late August when the ground is bone dry and dust is in the air. It's the scent of wildness and wandering. I'm certain that if I dragged you out here tonight, you too would find the horses and snow charming. You would appreciate the silhouette of my young oak tree all the way down at the end of the alley, and the distant shapes of Doug firs and cottonwoods. If I shone my headlamp on some of my favorite patches of lichen and moss, you too would be captivated by their beauty. But some of the magic that stirs my soul this evening is 2 decades of history, of memory, of practice. There was no lichen on the 3rd post when I first started walking this aisle. I have watched it grow. There was no oak tree down at the end of the alley. I planted it. There were no horse shelters here when we moved in. I built them. And the memory of the building is still deep in my bones. The memory of the windstorm that nearly pulled one of them out of the ground and tore at the roofs of all of them. There's memory of other denizens, gone now. Breezy, the most beautiful horse that ever flew across the earth. She did not walk or gallop. She floated effortlessly with the grace of a swallow or tern. And she greeted me every morning with laid-back ears and fury in her eyes. And every morning I would have to talk her down, talk her back from her own deep-seated memories of abuse and neglect and frustration and dread. I would wait for her to recall that yesterday I brought hay, not sticks or rocks. I would wait for her to collect herself, to ease back into the good place that was now her home. Parenthetical remark, any animal that manages to get here, that is, get to her property, they might as well have died and gone to heaven. It was over there in the pasture just beyond Samson's stall that I began practicing contemplation almost 20 years ago, sitting every morning at dawn, marinating my soul in grace and peace, savoring the light and the trees and the breath that I shared with birds and reptiles and mammals and 8 billion Homo sapiens siblings and cousins. I wonder, is the joyous ecstasy of this evening sharper and more exquisite because I have spent 5,000 mornings practicing being glad? I wonder, what has been the effect of 5,000 hours of deliberate attention to the beauty of the sky and trees beyond the pasture fence, and in imagination to the loveliness and sometimes heroic goodness of people? When I first began to sit in contemplation, I had no notion of building some future blessedness. I did not imagine being old and happy on a winter evening way off in the future. In fact, I went outside as a deliberate move away from the seeking, questing, striving that had been central in my spiritual life for decades. I went outside and simply enjoyed, savored the loveliness that was available. Tonight, walking in the snow-brightened darkness, I gave thanks for all those mornings, for the tuning of my heart to beauty, and for the magic of this present moment. And I long for a way to share it. I think, Gerald, that's enough for now.
Oh, I don't know. I was just warming up to a cold winter evening out in that alley. Wonderful. It's time for us to raise hands and react. I know many of you are. I saw Melody react when you talked about having offered that abused mare. Hey, she gets it. She knows. What about the rest of you? What do you think?
Well, and what I would also, if you and I talked, Gerald, I would rather watch a movie than read a movie review. I would rather go to a concert than read musical analysis. There's a place for reviews, there's a place for analysis, but there's also a place for just enjoyment. So I would be thrilled if any of my reveries spark your own wish to share something beautiful, some moment or some practice that you engage in that brings you into contact with the loveliness of creation.
Good. I'll start with one, and I'm hoping that you know this one. I have a favorite hike in the entire world. It's the Enchantment Loop. You've been there, haven't you?
I have only lusted after it because now it is highly restricted. It's a lottery system to get a permit to do it.
That's true.
I mean, yeah, and so I haven't done it. I have been around it. So please go ahead and paint as beautiful a picture as you can, because you cannot exaggerate it from what everybody has told me.
Oh, it's true. And my buddy, my best friend, Art Clem, has been with me. And I apologize to you, Art, because I took you on that loop. We did it in one day, John.
Oh,
you
yes.
Didn't need a permit. You don't need a permit if you're not camping. You're going through. And my testosterone took over, and I'm afraid that I drug Art through the most beautiful country in the entire world. Those crystal clear lakes, the rounded features covered by grass in the middle enchantment basin, the constant running water, bright light of sun filtered through trees that had leaves that had color reflected from that water, and clean air. I loved it, but I'm afraid Art was put down. He had a tough day. We had to drive home afterwards, and I felt fine. But Art had to drive home to Tri-Cities, and I think he was worried about falling asleep.
Yeah, I have hiked up into sort of the edge of the enchantments, from let's see, from the south.
Yes.
But I haven't gone down into the heart of it, and
Right.
it's on my bucket list. Yeah.
Yeah, do it in a day. Start early. Go for a long day in June. So worth it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the rest of you, what about this idea that nature can be relevant? Isn't it all cursed, John? I mean, I hear nothing but flooding, earthquakes, firestorms, and you seem to find and maybe divine these little excerpts of God. Are you being footloose and fancy free with what really should be considered profane, or is this truly sacredness?
I think it's an important question, and I'm eager to hear. I see folks with their hands up. I'm eager to hear, but boy, in Adventist circles where there have been arguments about geochronology, and this Earth history, sometimes people will claim that, well, on one hand you've got the rocks, but it's hard to read the rocks. But we have the clear word of God in the Bible, and it's so crystal clear. There's no mistaking of this. And I would point out that people who revere the book might have one or two opinions that are different. I mean, actually, the Bible is profoundly, there's a million denominations because the text is not that clear. Yeah. Is God genocidal, or is he, the God who, saves all? I mean, all those kinds of debates. And clearly, if you go to nature, so where I sit in my back pasture, I'm sitting on ground that was created 5,700 years ago by a volcanic mudslide, something called a lahar. It is one of the largest known in the world. It covered 200 square miles of surface. Mount Rainier lost about 1,600 feet of its top, came down and flowed, buried the forest and the people that were there. And then, now I'm sitting on this beautiful flat land, but it was created by cataclysm. And of course, Mount Rainier is 600,000 years old. It's sitting on top of twisted, convoluted, older rocks that began as islands out in the Pacific and were moved by tectonics and attached to the west coast of the US. And that, when you look at the rocks there, it's all twisted and turned. And you think of the kinds of compression, the kinds of catastrophes that happen to build the foundation for that beautiful Mount Rainier. And then you keep going. So nature is not all peaceful and sunshine or snow. Well, and snow, it can either be this beautiful stuff or it can be an avalanche that buries people, And so I would come down, I'm going, the reader is the key to what they see in the Bible. And the reader is the key to what we see in nature and what we choose to focus on. There's plenty of ambiguity. And I have deliberately, and what I say is I spend time, I don't spend 24 hours a day looking at loveliness. I spend an hour a day doing that, and then I go and do what needs to be done, which might include doing battle with something, but I begin with the loveliness.
I think that's a great place to start. Ray and Bobby Stovall, if it's possible, can you unmute and add to our discussion? There you go.
Patty Tompkins was up there first.
I'm sorry, I saw you first, so you're up. But Patty, you're next.
Okay.
I was just thinking, Gerald, something you said, footloose and fancy free. That was a caption under my Academy senior picture. Not exactly for these reasons, but for something else. But going to what John was talking about, first of all, one thing that always sticks in my mind, it was a winter day when it worked. It was really slow because of snow and ice and rain and all that stuff mixed together. So I took off, went home, got bundled up, and went for a hike in the foothills here because it was such a unique experience. You're the only person out there. You could go off the beaten path. You had freezing rain or drizzle, very foggy, and each step was something new. You were Nobody else was going to see it. So it was like a totally new experience. And that's why I think of nature, because as over the years in all of our travels throughout the mountains here and over in Utah as well, I always have a tendency to go off away from the group. The exploration, you never know what's around the next corner. No matter where you at, it's just like a whole new exciting world. Somebody else may have been there, probably were, but you don't know. So the way John was describing things, I love that reading that he did. That was awesome. Just for being out there that short period of time and having all of those thoughts, that's something that everybody can do, and it changes your way of looking at the world and your everyday life. The nature is such a positive experience. It is.
Good. Solid. What do you think, John? I know you're part of that.
I would just say amen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
I mean, well, this winter I'm a little frustrated because we have the perfect situation here where the snow is in the mountains and we're below the snow. But right now the snow is scarcely even in the mountains where I go, if we go up high enough. But so I go camping once a week, and I haven't been getting as much snow experience as I would like this winter.
Yeah, you're out there. I love it. Patty, what do you think? What are you feeling? Go ahead and unmute. We're still seeing. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I just had a few things that popped up that I would like to comment on. First of all, John, I'm a word person too, and I so appreciated your lovely, lovely weavings of words and experiences. That's just beautiful. The second thing I wanted to say was that there have been studies that show that kids who go barefoot or people who will go barefoot in the grass for 10 minutes a day have an improved state of emotional health. And I so strongly believe that. I was privileged to grow up in Southern California where we had, beaches, mountains, deserts, and I just gloried in being in all of that. And I remember going to creeks and fishing for guppies and climbing and hopping across the rocks in the deserts. And your stories of the horses brought back memories that really, really touched me that I hadn't thought about for a long time. We had some friends who had horses, and they would let us ride their horses and help take care of their horses. And I was just a kid, but it was such a beautiful experience to, like you said, have this huge animal and you're not a big person, and yet you can make this trust relationship between you and that horse, and then you ride it and they trust you and you trust them, and it's just a wonderful thing. And I thank you for prompting me to remember that today. And the third thing is, I just want to share one thing out of nature that was one of my most memorable experiences. And in 2017, we had the total solar eclipse. And right now I'm living in Cleveland, Tennessee, and that was right in the path of the eclipse. And I was able to stand out on my back deck and watch as nature kind of turned down the dimmer switch, and 1 minute and 37 seconds went by. And it was just absolutely glorious. What that dimming of light of the sun can do to the birds and just everything. And it was just amazing. And it so impressed me. I just, it was a glorious experience. And I hope everybody gets a chance to experience an eclipse at some point, because there's nothing like it. It's
We
just a
should
good
have an
memory.
Adventist Today eclipse party in April.
Yeah.
Because last year on our Talking Rocks tour, we were in the path of, it wasn't totality, but it was, I don't know, it was close, but it wasn't anyway. And so we changed we made sure we were in the right spot and that was impressive. But everything that I've heard from people who've gone and experienced totality,
Mhm.
I'm going to make sure I do that this April. And yeah, maybe we should do a whole big party somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That would be grand. Lynn Boyd, chime in. And my wife loves the quilt behind you on the wall, by the way.
Well, yeah, let me talk about the quilt first. My mom is homebound, so I often join you from home. And the ladies of the church that we belong to, as a community, got together and formed a quilting group, and this is their first quilt. They signed each square themselves, and this is a special quilt for us. Thank you.
It is. Go ahead, please.
I just want to observe, nothing prescriptive here, but I teach economics. I'm not an economist. I'm kind of a wannabe. So I see things kind of on a macro level. It seems that most of our observations today, and John, thank you for your great presentation, is a privilege. It is an exercise in privilege. Most of the people in the world today are in urban areas. They live in places where nature is being crowded out. Now, I understand that nature is really important, I think, for our soul. I spent a lot of time growing up in the Northwest, and I also got out and did quite a bit of hiking. Dad was the one who did a lot of that, and I enjoy it a lot. But it is really anymore. I'm realizing a privilege that most people don't have available to them. We in economics are obsessed with production, and in order to have production, we have to come together and specialize. And nature, like I said, gets crowded out. I wonder if we have missed the ideal, and that maybe the Native American Indians had it closer to the ideal. Just an observation.
I think I like your use of the word privilege. I think it's really important. So one of the things, well, look at where I live. I live 45 minutes from the trailheads where, I go trail running. Friends of ours who live close here, they had a student that had grown up in Beijing. And it was here that for the first time in her entire life, that student had ever seen a star. And she would go out at night and just be mesmerized by, you could see stars, because that simply was had not been available to her. And one thing further So I'm Gerald's asked, are you always this cheerful or sunny or whatever? And I said, yeah. And they go, well, most of the time, whatever. But I'm constantly reminded that even my practice is possible because of privilege of health, So, when I've known people who live with chronic pain. And I have to tell you, when I'm in pain, I'm not sunny. And if I'm in pain and I go out and I look at the sky, it does not have the same effect. And then I think of just recently, I was listening, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. And I was listening to some other music that I think of as being rooted in Appalachia. And if the shape of my life included the routine, the frequent trauma and hardship that is behind that music, would I be sitting here celebrating nature, or would I be singing about heaven because I could hardly wait to get out of it? So I want to bear witness to the glory and beauty that is available to me. And I want to celebrate it and all of that. But I am frequently aware that it's in a sense, I feel the obligation to my writing, in a sense, is an attempt to try to grab a little bit of this and share it, because I know it's not available to all. And when I'm out running trails and doing the crazy wild things I can do, I know that I can do those only because the dentist in town and the hygienist and all those people are open 5 days a week so that they can take care of me so that I can get back out there. Without that structure of civilization, I couldn't be out there. So my wildness is a flower of civilization that allows me to do it.
They're a great nurture. I'm happy for it too. Ruth Christensen, tell me what's on your mind. How has John triggered you? Unmute, please. You are still muted.
There she is.
Still muted. You have to unmute something there.
Ruth, we can't hear you. You're still muted, Ruth.
Use your indicator to go to the bottom row. On the left-hand side for mine, there's a microphone. Get that?
Oh.
Let's move on. You work on that, Ruth. I'm going to call you again. You work on that. Doug and Teresa in Oregon. Whereabouts in Oregon?
I'm in Eugene. We're in Eugene.
Excellent.
The sun is shining today, so we're enjoying that part of nature here, and gonna get out for a walk here in just a little bit.
Go ahead. Share with us.
So John's writings that I've read and his presentation today did trigger something in me. I grew up as an aficionado of aviation. That may seem a long ways away from nature, but I loved looking at Earth from above. I can only faintly imagine what it is to stand on the moon and see Earth the way a few astronauts have. And yet, in my aviation experience, I've been able to look down from above and see Earth, I think, from God's perspective, or at least more like it. It seems more perfect that way. And so I remember an experience specifically when I was in academy and we had a flight training program there. I remember my boss, who was also my flight instructor, I was over in the lab doing some recording late at night for the history class. And normally he didn't come, but he came that night and he was doing some, I don't know, grading papers or something. And it happened to be a wonderful evening with a bright moon shining across the hillside of the academy. And it was magical. It was absolutely magical. I could see that from inside through the windows. And I made the comment to my boss, wouldn't it be great to go flying tonight? And he said, shut up. Now, I didn't mean that in a mean or divisive or diminishing way. He meant it because he knew exactly what I was feeling. I was confident of that. Well, a longer story short, it was a few minutes later, we actually did go flying that night. And it reminded me of this wonderful, I'm not a poet. I struggle at times to even do good prose, but it reminded me of this wonderful poetry by a man I did not know personally, but is well regarded in aviation. And I just felt like it was important to share this. It's not long, but I think it shares the kind of soaring ideas that even the earthbound can understand, I think, with a little bit of imagination. And maybe Disney has done us some benefit in helping us imagine things that otherwise we would not experience. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soaring and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. John Gillespie McGee, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Doug. I see Ruth has unmuted herself. Gerald, you are muted.
Am I?
You are being heard. Thank you. Go ahead.
I am, and thank you. I was very touched by the fact that my pastor, my former pastor, and my special person in my life is someone that was mentioned, because my mother was someone that was absolutely wonderful. And I'll be, the end of this year, I'll be 90. And I have been blessed for that long to have that opportunity to have the joy of her is part of my life. And so that is something very special. I also happened to, my last husband was also a man that was a man of absolutely perfect joy, whom I was very fortunate to have for over let's see, it was almost 14, well, 6, 17, 45 years, 40. Anyway, he was wonderful. So I was been blessed in many ways. And I think that having grown up as a child all through this lifetime that I have been very blessed. And so I just want to mention to this that I've also, one of my favorite people was my pastor. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth. Gerald, you're muted.
Thank you for reminding me, John. Arthur Bowman, is that your phone number? We all know it now, but please add to the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
John, thank you for the very nice talk. I appreciate it. Living in Albuquerque, about 11 miles from Richard Rohr's Foundation for Contemplation and Action. Early in your talk, I noticed the comment that you were a contemplative. And then the talk concentrated, rightly so, on creation, on this the creation of this earth. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by being a contemplative?
Don't get me started. I could talk all day. But I'll make it simple. So I am referring primarily to my practice, my deliberate, structured practice. So every day, I get up before sunrise while there are, ideally, of course, there's days this doesn't happen, but my normal pattern is I get up while the stars are still visible. If I'm feeling really good, I get up before there is any hint of light in the east. And then I go outside and I sit, I have a stool and I sit facing east in our pasture. And I sit for about an hour. I take a thermos of coffee with me to try to keep me from freezing to death. And also there's something about holding something warm in your hand. It's interesting. I've seen some things that say that if you have a committee meeting and it's going to be full of conflict, have everybody hold a cup of tea or something like that, and having something warm in their hands will actually moderate some of the passions in the room. So I spend about an hour. I spend the first part of that focused on nature. At some point, I let my imagination move from what's in front of my eyes to the eyes of my heart, and I hold various people that I know in my heart, hold them with admiration and affection. And I remember reading some years ago, somebody was asking some monk about intercessory prayer, and he described intercessory prayer. He said, for me, it is holding people in affection in the presence of God. And so I kind of, I'm not asking in the sense that years ago I would have imagined as intercessory prayer, but I hold people and I attend to their goodness. In my life, I've got a number of people, I know a number of families who have children with profound disabilities. One that I'm thinking of just had recently again was reminded of the challenges in their life, but the son has just turned 50 years old. He's still in diapers and is nonverbal. So they've been caring for this child for that long. And when I hear people talk about total depravity, I'm going, what do you call the goodness of these parents who have, when you have a child, you dream your kid's going to grow up to be from Lake Wobegon, above average, smarter and brighter than everybody else. What is this goodness in a mother's heart that will carry a child for 50 years with no prospect of release? And then I can name others that I know personally who are in that situation. So those are the kinds of things I give my attention to when I'm sitting on my stool. When I first began, I would usually take 20 minutes of time where I simply live with my mantra, grace and peace. So yeah, I was laughing. Here I am. I've got a mantra, but it came straight out of the New Testament: grace and peace. And I would just live with those words, not asking for grace and peace, but basking in the reality of grace and peace. Does that answer your question?
Oh, John, I'm sure Richard Rohr would love that answer. Love it. I love it. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent to you both. And thank you for Richard as well. Linda Nottingham, I love you. How are you today?
Hi, Jerry. I'm good. It's good to see you. I'm glad you only dragged me around the golf course instead of what you did at the park. But anyway, just a couple of thoughts. When I take my retired racer Greyhound out in the morning when it's still dark, I can see Venus. But then, of course, I can never get Frankie Avalon's song out of my head for the rest of the morning. But I did want to sort of add something to what Mr. Boyd said. I think that's his name. A couple of years out of college, I think I've mentioned this before, I had the wonderful experience of spending a couple of years at the Holbrook Indian Mission. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that, well, the school was in a town called Holbrook, which is a miserable pimple on I-40. I mean, it's just really a horrible place. But the kids had to live there and go to school there. And when I was there, we had about 150 Indian children from kindergarten through 20 years old, still finishing high school. But without exception, it was very rough on them to live in town. And so on Sabbath, we'd pile as many as we could into a bus and haul them up to the reservation. And, we didn't really do anything, but they would just feel better having been out on the land. It's an absolute true phenomenon, I can tell you with certain experience, and it was remarkable to behold. But I do have a question for you, John. I've listened with interest to and inspiration to the things that you've had to say today. And my question is this. There are a couple of obscure texts, at least they seem so to me. I think Paul says something in a couple of places about that people have opportunity to learn to know God through nature, through what they've seen, even without access perhaps to other means. And about people also who would perhaps never have known about Jesus, but have lived by a conscience. And my question is this, do you think, as a philosopher, as a contemplative person, do you think that we would be as well served or perhaps even better served if the only way we had to learn and know about God was through nature? And what I mean by that is, we rely on scripture. I mean, most of us, at least I speak for myself, I co-teach an adult Sabbath school class, and I spend a lot of time studying to prepare for that since I'm not a biblical scholar. But is it possible that somehow scripture, notwithstanding the reverence that we ascribe to it, just simply gives us an arena to become confused and divisive and have unclear pictures of God because perhaps we fail in being able to understand or interpret properly what the biblical writers were saying? If we only had nature, would that be enough in your mind?
No. Humans, I think by nature, humans, and most of us anyway, we're somewhat philosophical. We ask questions that philosophy or theology addresses. And if we look at, we are deep in a Bible-informed culture. And so we're well aware of the problems that are associated with divisive, as you put it, divisive readings of Scripture. But no, I guess I would just say, let's look at cultures that do not have that, don't have Bible influence. And if we want to pick Native Americans, I smile at that. We use, some folks would use that phrase as though we were talking about one thing when we said that. But the Comanches and Apaches and Iroquois are not, those are not similar cultures. I mean, there's an incredible diversity, and some of those cultures were grand and noble, and some of them were pretty, from our perspective, depraved. So,
like us.
yeah, exactly. And I think often the difference in terms of how we treat nature. So people will say, well, native peoples, had they would treat nature. I'm going. The main difference was probably technology. We had a bigger bulldozer, and so we did more damage. But to me, it's not a smart thing to do to take the problems of one culture and compare them to the most glorious flowering of another culture. Because if you're gonna compare cultures, you want to compare the most glorious elements of both and the most depraved elements of both. And it seems to me that when you do that, you find that it's kind of hard to put one higher than the other. My wife gives me a hard time because I don't do Bible reading like I used to. But then as she was needling me last night, she pointed out, but I can't escape the fact that I pretty much had the thing memorized before I stopped reading it. So while I'm out there doing my nature stuff, the person who's engaged with nature is a person who was shaped by deep and pious engagement with the biblical text. So.
Okay. And I guess in part, perhaps my question stated another way, is do you think it's possible to have more of a two-way conversation if one is focused on nature rather than scripture?
I like your notion of the two. Well, so I mean, when I went back to scripture because I'm a preacher, and when I stand in the pulpit, I take the text seriously. I usually interpret it in ways that are maybe challenging to some traditional views, but I insist that I'm actually arguing from what the text says. I'm not inventing something, and I'm not distorting it. I'm dealing with the text. But then I'm very clear, but I'm also listening with respect to other voices that are outside of scripture, whether those are literary voices, which I haven't talked about much, or whether that's simply the witness of nature itself. But even our reading of nature is filtered through the glasses that we're wearing. If I have a friend who is working in Chad, and I just read a thing from her this morning. She was talking about she's becoming comfortable with death. 50% of the babies she takes care of die. I mean, 50% of the babies who are born in the community she lives in, they die. A significant number of the women die in childbirth. She's going in the world. She's from here. In Oregon, that's not the way life is, but that is life there, and that's nature. Nature's not very kind.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for the interaction, your comments today. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add on a piece to what Linda just brought up, John. Doug, with some apologies to Doug, referring to God as his perspective from above, do you think that it is at least as appropriate to believe that God is still with us rather than above us, looking down on us? I think your contemplative opportunities would suggest that he's still present. What do you think?
I remember some years ago reading Quaker literature, and reading especially the early, the first 50, 100 years, Quakers in England, and their fierce debates with the Protestants of the time, and Protestants emphasizing the Bible and Bible only, and the Quaker response going, so when Jesus left, God stopped talking. Wow. And they insisted, wait a minute, God didn't die, and he didn't go silent. He didn't become mute when Jesus left. And so they believed in the continuing voice of God. I would argue that all of theology really is metaphor. We're we're talking around God. And I don't mean that in a disparaging sense. You know, when we talk about God as Father, that's a metaphor. We talk about God as Mother, if we talk about God as Almighty, if we talk about God as King, you know, the reality is beyond our words. Words are valuable. I'm not disparaging words, but the reality is beyond them. Words are pointing towards something. And so you have the classic argument, the immanent God and the transcendent God. And certainly at this point in my life, if you listen to me talk, I tend to give a lot more attention to the immanent God, God in nature. But then I also want to speak, how to try to soften my tone, relax a little bit, and go that what I'm speaking comes out of my experience now. And I know fairly well people whose experiences do my description of God and their experience don't go together. And if I tried to take my picture of God and say, now this is it, God's this. If I listen to them, it doesn't work. On the other hand, I'll sometimes listen to them and they will describe their experience of God. And I go, yes, I hear you. That's amazing. And then they go, and that's your experience too. And I'm going, no, I've not had that experience. And they go, yeah, you have. I go, wait a minute. If you want me to believe you when you say God talks to you, and I do believe you, why wouldn't you accept my testimony when I say I've not had that experience? You know, so I tend to, if I was stepping back in a pastoral role, I would say, let's find the thing that helps us live. And there are different theologies. There's different ways of thinking about God that I think different people will find helpful. And at this point, I'm not committed to any particular one. I'm mostly committed to honoring what people tell me about their experience. And it tends to be somewhat diverse.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Terry Dunder, been with this. You've read some things that John has suggested for you. Share it with us.
Well, I noticed when you started off, you mentioned Pelagius, and it is a theologian. It rang true to me. I grew up all over the world. I've worked all over the world. I've seen good people in all cultures. And it seems that religion, ours included, is a cultural thing that has developed over the years. And because we hold on to this kind of authoritarian creation story, we don't have the ability to accept others as equal. And Pelagius, I think, was much closer to finding a way that all people could be accepted with, as opposed to just those who had the Gnostic truth. Another, in light of all the science that we have seen develop in the recent history, another philosopher, I think, was the philosophy of pantheism, which goes very well, I think, with what Pelagius taught. But it allows us to see in nature the infiniteness, if that's a word, of God, or whatever God is. Because I think if you go back into ancient religions, all the ancient cultures had some form or some perception of God. Many of them were much closer to the perception of God that I think is reflective of the loving God that Christ came to show us. Because his life showed a view of God or a concept of God that was, like you mentioned, a father, a mother, but only a good one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All the bad ones are well represented in the Old Testament and the New. Okay? You don't want that kind of God And I don't think we can sell it to an intelligent population. So when it says that knowledge was increased, I think knowledge has been increased now that we're going to have to back ourselves out of the theological tangle that we have created if we want to market a unique God. Otherwise, I think I would say God is coming back for everyone if he's coming back at all. And everyone will be saved if they're saved or accepted by whether they want to live in that type of world that God creates. Because I think many people today maybe wouldn't want to. Even many people on this call would say, I have it very nice right now. What would I change? What would make it better for me? I can see what would make it better for the poor people in Palestine. But they pray to the same God and get no answer. So what do you think about Pelagius?
If you're asking me, I just feel like my knowledge is actually so sparse. I laugh. It would be like, well, you see these signs, Facebook is the place where people who slept through science class comment on what the science, and I'm going, so, I have not read anything by Pelagius. And when I went back to Newell's book to read his chapter on Pelagius, I was laughing because I'm going, in that chapter, I read a whole lot of Newell, and I was going, I wasn't even, he was describing Pelagius, but there was not extensive quotes or what, so I'm going at this point, well, those who know me, since the system came down against Pelagius, I'm on Pelagius' side, but but again, that means I've deliberately not made any effort to characterize him, either to say here's what he thought or whether he was correct or not. Though what I have read about him makes me sympathetic to him. But you've asked me, I know more about geology than I do about Pelagius.
Yeah. Just to follow up, it seems to me that as religion, whether it be ours or whether it be any other religion, over time has constructed it in a way to make it most beneficial for those people who wrote it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good point. Thank you, Terry, for bringing that up. Lauren, you've been listening for a long time. Where does your head get taken by this former editor?
Well, yeah, I hold John in extremely high esteem. He is just, if you've ever been around John, he's a natural pastor. He cares deeply about people. If he's in your presence, he becomes somebody that pastors you. Before I comment, though, I'm going to say I want you to know who's coming next week. Next week, I have, I want to make sure I get this right, very interesting fellow from Loma Linda, Michael Schofield, and he preferred to be called Michael. Michael has worked in just about every field. Right now, he's got an appointment in the Loma Linda School of Nursing. He's going to be, I've told you guys all before that I try to be very intentional about rotating the topics, the sort of the general theme that I have. And I'm so glad that we had John this week to kind of take us into a more affective area. Michael is going to be doing a bit of church history for us. That's what he likes to study. Michael Schofield is going to be talking about, he's gone back and done a study, you'll love this. He's gone back and done a study of what were the topics that came up most often in the early Adventist church, including part of his study was the obituaries and how people wrote them. And so the topic is going to be what caused our ancestors salvation anxiety. Isn't that interesting? What were our ancestors worried about? What did they talk most about that concerned them the most? And so that should be a really good topic too. So we haven't had anything on church history, I don't think, since the Whipperdings did some pieces on church history for us. So we're back in February again to that was at the end of December. We're back in February again to church history. So this should be interesting. As Terry mentioned pantheism, John, it occurred to me that pantheism had a cameo in early church history in the discussion between Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg. Do you remember that correctly, John? I think I do. Ellen White made an accusation against John Harvey Kellogg that he was a pantheist, and that was bad. And so it's interesting that that word comes up. And so it gives me kind of a bit of a jumping off point, John. Let's see, John shows that he's not showing up and he's muted here. I don't know. Did we lose John? I hope we didn't.
I'm here, Lauren. I had
Okay,
muted myself
all right.
because the dog was barking.
All right. There's been a lot of hesitation in my signal, and so I wanted to make sure we were still on. John, I'm going to speak for those who don't get it like you do. Now, I should get it, John. I grew up on a couple thousand acre wheat farm. I spent most of my youth outdoors. I liked things. I do have some feelings for the smell of the prairie and thunderstorms and all of those things that I saw. And I still have my farm. In fact, I don't farm it myself anymore. One of the neighbors that we grew up with farms it now, but I still go out and visit it occasionally. But after becoming a pastor, I ended up moving into cities and living in cities. I still very connected to the outdoors. But you know, John, that whole concept of being a contemplative and really feeling all of that's going on in some deeply spiritual way doesn't work for me as well as it does for you. I want it to. I mean, I have dreams of having, because I'm so deeply rooted in the land, of being another Wendell Berry or Mary Oliver or Annie Dillard or I guess Robert Frost works a little better for me. I get him better. But to be a contemplative, I've tried, John, I've tried. I live too much in the rational part of my head. And I would like to understand. It seems to me, I love beautiful sunsets and I love beautiful outdoor experiences, but they seem too personal to me to either get your description of them or for me to share them in a way that would be deeply meaningful to others. In fact, I'll go one step farther, John, and that is that even though I love beautiful scenes and events, there's always a slight touch of disappointment in them. They're never fully satisfying. They're not the high that I wish they were. In fact, Frost has a wonderful poem called "To Earthward," where he describes how some beautiful sense, some beautiful feeling that he had the swirl and ache and sprays of honeysuckle that when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. Then he finishes it like this. He says, now no joy but lacks salt, that is not dashed with pain and weariness and fault. And when I read that, that is what happens to me. I feel the unsatisfaction of these experiences that were supposed to be so powerful. He says, the hurt is not enough. I long for weight and strength to feel the earth as rough to all my length. And he's talking about death, just as he was stopping in the woods on a snowy evening. He says, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And again, it's a very, there's something very dark about it. And I feel that in nature. I feel that sense of its incompleteness for my experience, that it all is going to end in death in some way. I have miles to go before I sleep, but I'm eventually going to sleep. So I'm speaking for those for whom the contemplative experience, the rush of nature's joy, is never quite fully satisfying. All right? Sorry to be a downer.
So going back to something I'd said earlier, when people close to me tell me about having conversations with God, God talks to them, and I listen to them, and their lives, it appears to me, are congruent with what they're telling me. And I go, that's wonderful. Until they go, and what does God say to you? And I have to go, he doesn't say anything. He does not talk to me. You know, what you are describing. And when I was 30, I thought, well, you know, I just need to be, you know, I need to be a little more faithful in my devotions. I need to, when I was 40, I need to go get anointed by, you know, somebody with some Pentecostal background, you know. So I spent decades seriously pursuing the kind of intimacy with God that is described in Pentecostal language.
Yeah.
And I didn't pursue it as a skeptic. You know, I hear them talking about an experience I would love to have. Mm-hmm. But eventually I said, you know, I think 25 years of intense focus effort in that direction is probably a pretty good trial. I'm going to do something different. Something that I haven't talked about here, I don't think I've talked about today, you know, is the euphoria experience in running. I can go into the woods and I can spend a couple of hours in a high that I've never had heroin, so I don't know what that's like. But I mean, just euphoric, just giddy with euphoria for hours running. And I remember some young friend of mine, he was wanting to experience the runner's high, and I go, well, how much are you running? He says, well, I'm up to 5 miles a day, and I'm wondering when is it going to start feeling good? And I go, wait a minute, you're doing 5 miles a day, and you're not feeling anything? I go, stop, go do something else. I don't have any notion that there is one practice that works for everybody. I don't think there's one metaphor that works for everyone. And some of what I'm experiencing, well, no, I'll stop with that. And I don't have enough knowledge and engagement with people to go much beyond that. I will add just this tiny bit more, is the euphoria, the enchantment, the enthrallment that I experience now is, I don't know that I should go back and look. I don't believe that was my experience when I started, 20 years ago. And so some of this is the fruit, when you do something for a very, very long time, the doing of it, has some effect on what goes on. And so, that there was a long process, and you're looking at me at a particular point in time, that's long after where I started. But again, I come back to this. I think we are shaped differently, and the contemplation has been a wonderful, rich experience for me. It's had the effect that the naysayers warned us about. Oops, I just did something?
You're okay.
Okay, yes. I remember, who was that guy who wrote, some Adventist guy who wrote, a book about how terrible contemplation was. I can't remember. But when he warned, it'll make you soft on sin and a few things like that. And I'm going, yeah, you're right. I tend to be less condemning than I used to be, more accepting, and I probably accept stuff. Well, I shouldn't say probably. I do accept stuff that, orthodoxy would certainly condemn. But my focus is, I have found a path for me to a place of great joy. And to the extent that I can share any little bit of that with others, I'm happy to do so. But I don't have the imagination that there's one size fits all.
Well, I'm very open to anything that is your experience, and I'm very open to people who are different than I am, and as you said, soft on sin, if that's what it means to be fully accepting of people who are gay, for example, people who are of different religions or atheists or no religion at all. That's fine. I'm with you there. I would like to know. I don't get any spiritual euphoria. I would like to know how you get spiritual euphoria. Running didn't do it for me. I've never tried psychedelic drugs, although I know there are people who get spiritual euphoria from them. I doubt very much that would solve all of my problems. I don't quite know how I entered this spiritual thing. I've tried lots of different things, John, and I envy you. I envy your ability to seek and find these sorts of things. For me, things exist on something of a cerebral level, and I approach my care for people that in the same way. I would like to have your experience. That's all I want to say.
Well, and I think we should point out, when you mentioned being cerebral, C.S. Lewis talked about that he found his most, I don't remember his words, but I think I would talk about the spiritual euphoria you're talking about. He said he found it when he was deep wrestling with some theological thing. He was rationally engaged with an intense scholarly investigation of some theological point, and he found that deeply satisfying.
Yeah.
And I understand that. I mean, because for me, if I'm working on something that can, that math can address, I find it really fun to wrestle with problems, to use that part of my brain, and I kind of slip into a groove, and it's fun to work with it.
He also mentions the great joy of sitting and talking with theology with somebody over a pint of ale and smoking his pipe.
Yeah.
So, the way it worked for him somehow. It's not what I would recommend to anyone, but I'm there.
Yeah,
I understand the notion of wrestling with ideas more than I understand the euphoria of a great sunset. Even though I like great sunsets, I'm not criticizing the great sunset or the beautiful snowfall. I love those things. I look forward to them. They're always a little disappointing. They're never quite as good as they should be, nor would I expect to experience someday in the presence of God. Anyway, that's all. Thank you, John. I love you.
Thank you. Let's hold that, maybe come back to it if we need to. But Dick Myers, you've been patiently waiting. Tell me what direction this has taken you.
Well, I'm going to take a direction back to kind of where we started. But first, John, thank you so much for stimulating all of the thinking and conversation that we've had. It's been really interesting. One of my favorite sacred spaces over the years has been at the helm of a modest sailboat, sailing with a fresh breeze and a gentle sea, and with perhaps a dolphin or two playing in the bow wave. And, this to me is as close probably to heaven as I've ever been on earth, and especially at night. I remember a passage one night from Freeport to Nassau in the Bahamas, and we were sailing a pretty good sized boat, and it was a very comfortable evening. And the sky was undescribably beautiful. And of course, we were far enough out that there were no lights that detracted from our experience, and it was just beautiful. Anyway, that's kind of what has been probably the most peaceful and regenerative experience that I've ever had. Just a comment, possibly a question. I really appreciated your perspective on creation. And I think so often we get bogged down in trying to describe the details, and we miss the mystery and the joy. And I wonder, could this also apply to the way we look at Sabbath? That's a question.
I will take a stab. Maybe I understand. Seems to me that, well, I going way back, my experience was that when I would describe to secular people my Sabbath, they would go, "Oh, wow, I wish I could have one of those." And the world that I lived in was people more by secular people than by conservative Protestants who wanted to argue about what day it was, or by Adventists who wanted to argue the details about what was allowed and wasn't allowed. If you take the notion of Sabbath and begin to live it, if you have this sacred space that's protected from commercial, the drive to achieve and accomplish and conquer, I think it becomes its own recommendation to people who live in the routine 7-day 24 struggle to make their own world.
Yeah, and I guess what I was driving at was that, I was raised as a very fundamentalist Adventist, and probably only recently begun to feel the joy of the Sabbath. And I think, to me, it's a perspective that we could well spend more time contemplating, talking about, and practicing.
I agree, though I would put in this word for fundamentalism in that respect. I remember reading, I think it was Wayne Muller's book on Sabbath, and a lot of people buzz, and I may have the wrong book. And then I read what he actually was thinking about with Sabbath. He was grabbing 10 minutes here and a half hour there and trying to call them Sabbath time. And I'm going, no, you really don't have any idea what you're talking about. That to experience the joy of Sabbath, you have to also embrace the disciplines of Sabbath. Contemplation, I talk all about the euphoria and all that kind of stuff, but I don't talk about the 3 layers of clothes that I have to wear to stay warm. And I don't talk about, you got to get up and get out of bed and go do the thing. The same thing for running. Most of the if we're going to, quality life, spiritually and otherwise, is never separable, I believe, from discipline. And so to have a good Sabbath experience requires some Sabbath discipline. Now, if all you've got is discipline and no joy, then you might want to check it out and see, see what's wrong. But joy is like the whipped cream, and if it's not undergirded by some discipline, you won't get the cream.
Yeah, thank you for that course correction, and thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you. Angie Lima, you're a professional perceiver, a listener. Where has John taken you today?
Well, can you hear me?
I can hear you clear. Thank you.
Well, this is a comment that he made in passing, and I don't think it's really pertinent to the whole talk, but that's the comment that he made that caught my attention, and I like to comment on it. And that was when he said some people are so afraid of not being saved because they're not perfect, and he looks around and see some folks like the ones, parents that he mentioned, taking care of this child for 50 years, and some others. And this is one thing that always bothered me when I was still in the Adventist church, which I'm not anymore. The thought that, so many people out there supposedly are not going to be saved. And I used to think, how can they not? Regardless of what they believe, just because they don't keep the Sabbath or they don't do this, they don't do that, they're not going to be saved. When I was in training after medical school in residency, one of my classmates was an atheist. And this girl was one of the most loving, most kind people I've met in my life. She's a fabulous doctor today. And I used to, I thought it was a privilege to know her and to have her in my class, my graduating class in residency. So John made a comment once in one of his sermons that I read as his blog, because obviously I was in his church. And he was talking about precisely this subject of people being afraid of, no salvation because you got to be perfect. And you said something very profound, John. You said the Savior would never accept such a loss. You said that. And that stuck with me, and profoundly, because what you were saying was he came to save the world. And 144,000, really? And you said he would never accept such a loss, meaning he would never accept the loss of millions of people being lost. He would never accept that. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I will shamelessly plug my little story that I think Gerald referred to. You can get it on Amazon. I think it'll cost you $1. Damn My Son, D-A-M-N, Damn My Son, is my effort to try to, paint a picture of a saving God. We typically, in the parable of the lost sheep, the story of the lost sheep, notice that at the end of the parable, all are inside the fold. It's not just the lost sheep that's inside the fold, all are in the fold. And at the end of the story of the prodigal son, both sons are in the father's house. And even the older son that, clearly the parable is told, he's the jerk in the story. But the last thing we hear from the father to the older son is, all that I have is yours. Somebody will ask, well, will God force people to be saved? I don't know. Some preachers imagine themselves as God's prosecutors and they're trying to eradicate evil. I imagine myself as a lawyer for the defense, and I'm going to get everybody in. And, what the ultimate reality is, I'll leave that to others. But in terms of my disposition, my stance toward the world, if Jesus is the Savior, I figure he's pretty good at his job, and I figure he's going to save people.
Good. Well stated. Thank you. I'm going to tangentially put one in before Clifford joins. Rebecca asked the question in response to your use of a little phrase in your contemplation about holding people we care about in the presence of God. She found that extremely beautiful, as did I. But she says this, and I want you to comment. I struggle with how to pray for others without telling God what I think he should do with them. How do you answer?
Yeah, it takes me back to fairly early on in my sitting outside at dawn, where, I would hold my church, but at that time I was pastor of a small church in near Federal Way. And, I would hold my church members and in the presence of God. And I remember there was a couple in the church that was having significant marital difficulties. And so, I bring this, in my imagination, I bring this couple before God. Okay, God, we gotta do something here. And then I'm laughing. I'm shaking my head. I'm going, okay. So God says, no, John, why don't you do it? Here, you've got my ring. You go, you fix it. Whatever you want to do, you do it. And I'm going, what's a God to do? Because these two people, I mean, if there was ever two more mismatched people, I don't know if they exist. And I'm the only way now. The woman had a bit of a temper. Okay, so God, let's fix the woman. But the guy, well, anyway, I from my perspective, the only way God could fix this would be to basically erase the hard drive on both of them, and put in put a new operating system in. And then you're going, but at that point, actually what he did is he killed the two people.
Wow.
Because he has erased those people. And I'm sitting there going, poor God, what's God what does he do here? I don't know. And it kind of fixed me thinking, well, God, if I just, if you would just use your power, if you would just do the thing, I'm going, I saw no way to, I was speechless in front of this human dilemma. And I imagined God sitting with me being speechless and brokenhearted too, because they're his kids. It was a mess. So I held them in my heart. I still hold them in my heart. What can I say? I love these folks, and life was difficult.
I think that's how God asks us to react, is to love. Thank you. Clifford, take us to
appreciate you. Hey, John. Hadn't
Hey,
talked to you
Cliff.
in a while. Good seeing you. It's funny because I grew up secular. I like nature. I don't think I ever one time looked at it and it ever entered my mind that there was a God, a creator behind it. The way I was programmed. But now, I mean, I see, I get into what you're saying. I don't get out and contemplate. I could just, my wife, sometimes we sit down for breakfast and I look at the fruit and I just marvel at it. And a while back, a grapefruit seed, and I was thinking, you put this thing in dirt, and we, it's like, if we didn't see it with our own eyes, why would we believe it? But I guess what I'm saying is, I see the reality of God in creation everywhere. It's like I can't unsee it. I see it everywhere. And as we understand the more complexity of everything, I see it even more. Now, look, we live in a fallen world. We know there's floods and pandemics and all that. And yet even below that, I mean, just and I think of those verses. And again, Paul, I wondered the other day, when I was younger, every now and then I used to think that maybe there was a God, and I always pushed it out of my mind because I thought if there was a God, I was in trouble, which was kind of odd because but anyway, Paul says in Romans that they'll be without excuse. And from the creation. And I sometimes wonder if the reason, because now to me it's so obvious, a creator God. I mean, it almost seems willfully blind to deny it. But I wonder if people do that because they might be afraid to have to meet the God on the other end of that. And of course, that's where the gospel comes in. I'd be afraid too to have to meet him. But anyway, I guess what I was saying is I just now, the reality of God and the reality of God's love is the most obvious truth I know. Now, I didn't get here overnight, and I see it in the created world. I'm in the Florida Keys right now. At the last minute, somebody got hurt, and I got to go preach for him. And I'm going, Mark Finley broke his pelvis and asked me to come to a camp meeting, but I'm now in the Keys, and just the water. And it's just, anywhere you go to the desert and it's beautiful. You look, it's like everywhere you look, but you open your eyes. And Lauren, I wonder with your experience, if maybe you're thinking it through too much. I wonder if you just were in nature and just looked at it with your heart and so on. Again, I don't know. I'm not judging you. I'm just thinking that maybe then you could experience, more, because it just, so I can relate to what you're saying, John, in many ways about just your experience with it. But anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. I didn't get here overnight. One other super quick thing. I wasn't born again yet. I had some heavy experiences that opened me up. I was running through an airport in Amsterdam to catch a plane. I had 2 Granny Smith apples in my hand. And I'm running for the plane, and it was the first time this ever happened to me. I stopped and I looked at those apples, and it was, I felt this electricity. I could see the reality of God's love. It was as if God was smiling down and little heart emojis were coming out of the apples. In other words, I saw the reality of the Creator's love. And it was my first time, and I got on the plane and I saw a couple of girls I knew from high school. And this is probably the first time I ever witnessed in my life. I wasn't even a believer yet. And I started going on about God's love in the apples. And this girl said to me, "You're into your apples too much. Why don't you just eat them?" Okay. But that was my first experience. And now I can't unsee it. I don't know. Anyway, just a few thoughts for whatever they're worth on that. So,
thanks, Cliff. And one of the things I want to highlight, I really love your apple story. There, in the realm of spiritual life, in many places, you have 2 distinct elements, it seems to me. There is gift that comes to us and we have zero control over it. If I was laughing, Lauren, what you need is a near-death experience. Because you read these people, they have these near-death experiences, and apparently the evidence is most people who have those, it has a profound thing. You don't plan those, okay? And then there is stuff that is, there's the disciplines we engage in, and neither one is a substitute for the other, and they're not the same thing. Anyway, I just think it's important for, so with that apple, I'm going, yes, God stepped into your life. He gave you this moment of vision, Cliff. It's like, boom. And for somebody to deny that, I'm going, wait a minute, did you just hear what this guy said? But then you can't tell somebody else, well, don't you see these apples? No, they don't.
No. Because I think
the value of your story, and it's part of the reason why I tell my story, is I'm going, but occasionally, well, I listen to your story about the apples, puts a big smile on my face because, okay, sometimes he steps in. Sometimes he steps in, and that, yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, you know, it's funny. Sometimes at breakfast, I just sit there and my wife, every now and then, my wife will say, "Can we just eat? Can we just eat?" And it's like, but I don't want to lose. Oh, what's the word? I don't want to lose. Oh, I'm trying not to transcend. It's just the majesty of it. I mean, we take it for granted. You stick this little pellet in the ground with dirt, and this tree's gonna come up with all this. But if you really think about it, it's a miracle. It's astonishing, and it just screams to me about the reality of God's love. And my says, "Yeah, okay, I see it. Now just eat." But anyway,
There you go. Thank you.
Sure.
Appreciate that. Before we close out, and we will continue to converse until 3 o'clock my time, 1 o'clock the West Coast, wherever you are. I've asked John. John, would you be willing to offer a short prayer over all of us before we all say goodbye?
Sure.
Let's do that right now.
All right. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look on you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Art Clem, it's your time. Take us where you wish.
Well, somebody.
You're muted, Art.
You just muted yourself. You were on, and then you.
Okay.
There you go.
There's always a downer in any club or any group, so I'm going to assume that mantle, as I so often do. I'm going to use a really crude term here, and I apologize. You're all adults and you've heard it before, but Cliff was talking about how marvelous it is that you put a seed in the dirt and it germinates, and how wonderful that is, how miraculous that is. You know, that seed will germinate and grow much better if you mix some shit in with it.
Yeah.
So that's a reality that life brings to us. Randy raised in chat a while back about how this whole discussion about the contemplative life and contemplation is something that only people of privilege get to engage in. And that's what we are today, a group who gathered together who are privileged in a way that the vast majority or the great majority of the rest of the world are not. And we all can afford these fancy little machines that enable us to talk to each other across continents. And but there are those who live on the margins that don't enjoy this contemplative existence that we do, or that we imagine we do. Those on the margins are worried about where their next meal is coming from. Those on the margins are worried where, if they will, well, the only euphoria available to them may be in their next drink or at the end of a needle. And we condemn them for doing that or for being that way, but we're complicit in a society that gives them only those methods to experience that euphoria that we talk about our own as though it's something holy. One of the things we've talked about a lot today is, well, one thing we talked about was near-death experiences, just in passing. But near-death experiences aren't always happy. Lofthouse tried to introduce me to one on that 20.5-mile hike that had 7,200 feet in elevation gain.
Now you're brave.
Yeah, I survived. But we talk about how nature reveals God, but the story of mankind is how our struggle against nature, our struggle against the powers and forces of nature. It was mentioned by someone, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, talked about how in some parts of the world, how high maternal mortality is and how high infant mortality is. Is that part of nature as well? What does that reveal about God, if it reveals anything at all? As we were talking about nature, well, let me make one other comment before I go to the real downer, and that is that we have kind of sanctified nature by removing some of the more disagreeable elements and set up these national parks. And we keep to the minimum we have to, the grizzly bears and other predators. And then some idiot will get out of their car and approach a buffalo and think everything's fine because we have this glorified view of what nature really is. I think of the term nature red in tooth and claw. I'm going to just mention one other thing about nature. And we make up stories. Well, one other thing, and then I'll summarize. I think of a picture that I just saw again in the last week or two, and you have all seen it. It's many years old, many, many years old, but of a small child sitting, who's very emaciated and sitting alone, crouched or maybe squatted. I can't quite remember it, but I can see the overall impact of that picture. And sitting behind that child who's obviously dying is a vulture waiting for his next meal. Is that part of the nature that we talk about? It's not one that we contemplate and feel any sense of euphoria. What we do here and what we do in various churches and in various societies, and the Adventists have done their own, is make up stories to try to explain that and try to fit that into a picture of God. We have to make up such stories. If we don't, we'll be so depressed that you'll never think about a God.
I disagree. We don't have to make up stories.
We don't have to, but we have. So, and we say an enemy has done this. An enemy has broken in and done it. I heard somebody talking the other day, a discussion between an atheist and a Christian. And the atheist was making the point that God must love sin because he made so much of it. And said that if you were told that if you had this child, if you and your wife had a child, and that child would cause great suffering around the whole world and kill millions of people, do you bear any responsibility if you create that child? So I'm just throwing out stuff here, but some of us aren't satisfied with the stories we've made up to explain these.
All right. I'm going to interrupt, Art.
I'm done anyway. I'm done.
Yeah, I'm laughing a little bit. You're doing a little catalog listing there. You know, you didn't have much focus to this, except, well, there's problems. Now you will notice that in my presentation of nature, I didn't try to answer any of those questions. And in fact, I made slight reference to a few million year history of upheaval and chaos. And part of what I have done as a contemplative. So when you contemplate something, you are narrowing your focus. That's an intentional act. So I'm sitting there narrowing my focus for a while. And I have deliberately stepped away from all of the answers to the big questions that you would like to raise. The questions of suffering. I mean, the question you just raised, the last one. So if we blame, it's Adam and Eve's fault. Well, no. God put Adam and Eve in a dangerous environment, did not put a fence around that tree. What kind of dad was that? Yeah, so it's easy to do that. And that's, so in my approach, I have deliberately stepped away from those, because I don't know any answers to any of those questions that I find satisfying. Well, and neither do I find satisfying sort of the flip side would be, you have a universe. Clifford was amazed at grapefruit seed. I'm going, how do you build the soil? And then the soil, you trace back to the evolution of heavy elements from helium and the stellar evolution. And I do not know how you reduce what we know of the cosmos to any coherent theology. And so I don't make that effort anymore.
Yeah, Ray pointed out just a moment ago, and it's what I was thinking of, and he put it in writing. Right now, we're waiting for the verdict in a case in, is it Michigan? Where a parent left, bought a gun for a teenager, made it available to him, and he went out and killed some people. She's charged criminally with that. She didn't do it, but she put the tool there, made it available to him, and he did it. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. And it's one we have to answer in a more cosmic scale.
If we are doing theology, we do have to answer it. And I've stepped away from theology.
Wisely.
Well, no, it's just.
No, I don't mean that sarcastically. I mean that literally. I think that's wise.
Well, but I mean, what you said earlier, we, meaning humans, we've got to have these stories.
Yeah.
But we, meaning individuals, do not have to have the story. We can make the choice to acknowledge that we can't tell it.
Yeah, and I think that we, and you have advocated for this kind of thing, we as a society need to step up and take on the responsibilities for a lot of the pain that's caused by the system we've created.
Yeah.
Because we have created systems that do cause people misery and pain, and we need to do something about that.
Where we
Thank
can,
you.
yes.
We'll leave that on our minds. That's heavy, Art. Thank you. Terry Docking, you have thought about this for a long time. Unmute. Tell us where this has taken your fertile mind. You're still muted, Terry. Please unmute on the bottom row. Use your stylus. Should be at the very bottom of your display. Mute button or not mute. Not happening. You're still muted somehow. Try it one more time if you can. If you can't, Bobby Stovall, if you've still got something to say, I'd love to hear from you. Not happening, Terry. Keep working on it. If I see you blank out, I'll come back to you. Bobby Stovall, if not, Terry Dunder, you had another thought. Share with us. Terry, you're on.
I'm
Good.
on. Great.
Way to go. Thanks for your persistence. What's up?
I'm from Brisbane in Australia, and it's Sunday. Talking about contemplative things and contemplating nature. I don't know the statistics. I'm not a mathematician, although I'm a elementary year 4 teacher. But I'm suggesting that there's probably a couple of billion people that fit into the category that we're talking about. The rest of the population of the world is not so privileged. I'm just thinking about how contemplating the Americans were when they scrambled up the black sands of Iwo Jima. I'm just wondering what they were contemplating, or the green jungles of Vietnam, or some of the peaceful fields of France. I'm ex-military, and I just find it difficult to think that a lot of people don't really contemplate God. My wife's father fought in Papua New Guinea, which some of you may be familiar with, on the Kokoda Trail, facing the Japanese. He did not see God, even though he was a Catholic. He did not see God there. He did not contemplate God in the wonderful jungles of Papua New Guinea, and I imagine the Americans who scrambled up the shores of Iwo Jima, the black sands, which look quite beautiful, really, did not contemplate God either. It's just a thought that I had while we were talking about peace and nature and sailing boats and sitting watching the stars. And I've done some of those things. I was what we call in Australia a sea scout and sailed boats for many years. And I understand some of that peacefulness, but most of the people in the world are not that privileged to be able to experience those wonderful things that some of you are talking about, and not that I'm denigrating it in any way, they are wonderful God experiences. But I would suggest that most people don't.
And I guess, Terry, what I would say, and what I try to do the older I get, is I ask people what their experience is. So I don't talk about what, quote, their experience is. I ask them, what is their experience? So in this case, you're sitting there, part of the privileged community, and a couple of other folks have, we've talked about those people. It'd be kind of interesting to ask those people what their experience is, rather than describing their experience, whether it's privileged or unprivileged. Anyway, I just leave it at that. We can theorize what the underprivileged experience. The older I get, the more reluctant I am to do that. Sometimes they teach me things.
Thank you for both of you. Bobby Stovall, thanks for your patience. Chime in.
Hi, I have really enjoyed everyone's comments about this topic. It was very refreshing to me. And I just wanted to share my experience of brief euphoria. Years ago, a group of us from church would go four-wheeling in the mountains. And being on top of the mountain, getting out of the Jeep, standing in that ice cold wind, looking down over the mountains, seeing a tiny little tree that has somehow sprouted and is trying to grow, the majesty, just, it's indescribable. It's maybe what I would refer to as one of those euphoric moments. And then again in the evening, as I am walking my dog for his last potty break and looking up into the sky, and I can relate with you, John, that there's too much light pollution, but I can still see some stars. And I look up and I think, God, I know that you are up there somewhere. I know that with all of my doubts and fears and concerns and everything else, I know that you are there. And that's as profound as I'm going to get, but I wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you so much, John. You're coming home. It's working.
I will say something.
Oh, the horse maven here has something to say.
Oh, please speak, Carl.
So I live with this guy, John, and sometimes, when I got married, my fear was that I would be bored, and God answered my prayers because it's not been a boring run. Anytime I think I might know him, he surprises me. And I'm not really a contemplative. I mean, I've had moments of euphoria with tears running down my face, listening to music and reading scripture. And I've had the same euphoria when I've been out. One time I went out, I had to do something out, and it was real late. And I was out in a paddock, and it was 10 degrees. And I could not bring myself to go inside because of the beauty. So, not being a contemplative, I was picking rocks out of the horse paddock because it needed to be done. But I was doing it because I couldn't bring myself to go inside because of the beauty. And I was having a wonderful time picking rocks out of the horse paddock. And I see in nature in many ways, not just being out. I mean, I've had the privilege of, I like to ride horses and being up in the mountains and going where most people never get to go because they can't walk that far, and seeing things. On the other hand, some of the other things I've seen in nature have been right here on my farm, which have just blown me away. And I've thought about writing a book about seeing what is written in the minds of animals of justice and mercy. For example, just to give you one, seeing a stupid duck who wanted to be a mom and could not manage to cover up 15 eggs because ducks lay lots of eggs. She was big and plump, and she could not figure out how to do this. And seeing my smart duck, whose name was Anne, lovely runner duck, as skinny a duck as you could ever imagine. You wonder how she could ever be a mom because she's so skinny that she stands straight up and she's hardly anything, and she can cover up 15 eggs with no problem. And so she gets up on top of it. She sees this solution. She sees this problem. Nobody told her. I couldn't tell her how this other duck was struggling, but she sees this other duck struggling, and she's been a mom. So she gets up on top of the duck and sits on her back and takes her long neck and pushes all the eggs underneath that other stupid mother. And she does this every day until those eggs hatch.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And I see God's love and mercy in the things that the animals do. I've been lucky that way because we've had enough horses that it's been a herd, and you see how they interact with each other. We have enough chickens, and we have enough ducks, and we've had enough cows, and I've seen cows mourn their young. It's tangible. You go out in the field and the calf shouldn't have died. We wondered why she died.
Yeah.
You know?
You've had the opportunity to observe. You're very good
So
at that.
I observed that, and it speaks to me eloquently of even in this world, if you look and you observe, there's wonder. There's the wonder of God's grace and mercy.
May we all listen well. Thank you. Randy Robertson, you got the last chance here today. What do you have to say, dear?
Oh my. After that, I feel like I'm Debbie Downer. So John, privileged but from the margin here. I live in Western society. I have my entire life. I'm from a good socioeconomic strata. But I live in a community that, from the state that I currently reside, they're literally seeking to erase my existence as a human. Contemplation does very little for the latter. Probably nothing. Now, contemplation does maybe do me some good, but it does nothing for the human on the margin who literally is hoping not to be erased from the society. I'll leave it at that. So, I love nature, and I think there's great value there. But boy, if all we do is sit around and contemplate, and that does not turn into action, serious action, we got a problem.
John, there's your invitation. How do you pastor?
So I would emphatically agree with you. And I would add that if all we do, well, I won't say it that way. If we respond vigorously and consistently to evil without some regular nourishing of our soul, there's a high risk that we will end up becoming a mirror image of the evil that we're combating. So me, the value of contemplation is to anchor my soul, myself, in some sweetness and loveliness, so that when I then go to do battle, I'm coming from that place and not merely parrying the, that which I'm opposed to. I mean, that's my concern always, is that we can become fascinated, obsessed with our opponent, and end up in a dance that actually is controlled by our opponent rather than by us. So, contemplation is not at all a substitute for vigorous action, for social justice, and for justice. But I believe contemplation can help to anchor us, so that as we go into the world to seek change, to seek justice, we'll do it from a place that is full of light.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your blessings to us. It's time to go. May we all go out with a resolve to be more observant, to hear more loudly, and to speak when called upon. And remind you that next week, Michael Schofield will present on a historical presentation of early Adventists and their most serious cause for salvation anxiety. Think about that. See you next Sabbath. Have a great week. I love you. Bye-bye.